Good evening, everyone. Glad you're with us tonight. We'll dive right in, waste no time. This week we will start a three-part series that kind of looks at some of the most important figures, people groups, and then kingdoms or empires of the early Middle Ages, where we're in right now here in Europe. Next week we'll take a look at England under the Anglo-Saxons, and then later under the Normans, and the British Isles as a whole, and particularly the monastic tradition that arises there. And then following that, we'll look at the Vikings and just how dramatically they affected all of Europe as a whole, both societally and then in the church as well. But we'll begin this week with the Merovingian and Carolingian dynasties of the Frankish Empire, which you may never have heard of until today. We'll look at them, the dominance of the Frankish Empire, and then the coming of Charlemagne, the first Holy Roman Emperor. And the reason we're looking at these three groups, that is the Franks, the Anglo-Saxons, and the Vikings, is simply because of the enormous impact they would have on the development of European society as a whole, but then also on the development and the influence of the church all across Europe and then eventually the world. During the reign of Napoleon, one of his most consistent enemies was the royal house of Bourbon. I know the French isn't that's not how you say that in French, but I'm not going to try. The House of Bourbon. They constantly resisted his authority, his right to rule. They pointed to their own ancient heritage as the source of their authority to rule over France. And the most prominent symbol of their authority was the fleur-de-lis, which I'm sure you've seen before. A legitimately ancient symbol that did date back all the way to antiquity. And to one-up them, Napoleon turned to the, at the time, relatively recent discovery of the tomb of Childeric I, who was one of the first Frankish kings. And he settled on one of the symbols discovered in the tomb, and that was a number of golden bees. Since ancient times, particularly in ancient Egypt, bees had been symbols of immortality and divinity and even resurrection, often with honey being the food of the gods. Napoleon saw the bee as both a tie to the ancient world and also a tie to the ancient heritage of France itself. And so in many portraits of Napoleon, like this one, if you can look closely at his robe, he's clad in his royal garb. His clothes are adorned with golden bees to further emphasize that dual-natured symbol. Why does this matter at all? Because Childeric, that ancient Frankish king, was the son of Merovic. And Merovic was the founder of the first great dynasty of Europe outside of the Western and really the Eastern Roman Empire. And that was the Merovingian dynasty. And with the rise of the Merovingian dynasty comes the real beginning of a recovery from the fall of Rome in the West and on into the early Middle Ages, where we are now. At this time, when there's a power struggle heating up all across Western Europe, to sort of replace the authority of Rome, the Merovingians are the first to really step in and grab land and dominate militarily on a large scale and really dominate and exercise control over Western Europe. The Merovingians date back to a number of Frankish tribes that are recorded as far back as the early 2nd century. And many of these tribes were among the Germanic tribes that would go on to war against the Romans and then eventually overthrow them. But the Franks were a little bit different because the Franks, and if you can see the map in particular, the northwest corner, the Salian Franks, they were the first of all of the Germanic tribes to actually come down into Roman territory and actually come alongside the Romans as sort of allies and trade partners. Most of the other Franks maintained their cultural identity, their religion, etc. But the Salian Franks did begin to partner with the Romans, and they began to commingle with them. And these Salian Franks, but also the other Frankish tribes, and then many other northern tribes as well, would go on to form the backbone of what we can still see today as the sort of Germanic culture of all of northern Europe. And we should stress that the Franks weren't just the first Frenchmen. They were, at this time, still very Germanic in essence. And they were also, beyond France, the forefathers of a number of different European cultures, which includes the German culture and the cultures of the Low Countries. So that's the Netherlands and Belgium and Luxembourg, to name just a few of them. And this is because the areas to the north of the old Roman border lines share a common Germanic past. Most of these tribes, at least when they were pagan, spoke similar languages. They worshipped gods that were at least similar, if not almost identical in nature. And it had been this way for many centuries. So the Franks don't bring about a revolutionary new way of life. They're just supplementing or often replacing, in some places, much of the old Roman culture with an already present Germanic cultural base. And the originators of this, as I said, the Salian Franks, they came to call themselves the Merovingians, the sons of Merovic. They're also known to history as the long-haired kings, because all of the written and pictorial image evidence from the time depicts the Merovingian kings with at least shoulder-length hair, or even longer. And this was because of a common pagan belief among the Merovingians and then also among some other tribes that long hair was a symbol of strength and prowess in battle. That long hair was almost a sort of protective talisman to help you fight well in battle. As similar as it sounds, this does not have any known link to the story of Samson or the Nazirite vow in the Old Testament. And there's a significant difference between these two. Samson and the Nazirite vow, that was done for the purpose of ritual purity, especially the growing of the long hair. Whereas for the Merovingians, it was a symbol of strength in battle. The Merovingians were also pagans. They had resisted the expansion of missionary movements by the Arians, in particular, into northern Europe that had begun in the early 4th century. Many tribes, the Gothic tribes in particular, had converted to Arianism, Arian Christianity. But the Merovingian Franks had very notably resisted. They were still polygamists. They still had their own pantheon of gods and their own odd rituals and worship practices devoted to their gods. And so Merovic and his son Childeric, the first two Merovingian kings, were rank and file pagans, like all their forefathers before them. And they have very little to do with the expansion of the Christian faith. But everything dramatically changes when Childeric dies and his son Clovis comes to the throne, who actually is the picture that we're seeing. Clovis is significant for two reasons. First of all, he was the founder of the first truly Frankish kingdom. And second, he would eventually become the first Christian Frankish king. He was exposed to the faith by one of his wives, Clotilda, who was not only a Christian, but oddly enough for the area, a Nicene Christian, not an Arian. She believed in the Nicene Creed, and that was what she that message was what she brought about to Clovis. She spent years trying to convert him, to no avail, to the point where, out of fear of Clovis almost, she had to baptize two of her sons in secret. Eventually, though, Clovis relents and he hears out his wife, and then he converts to Christianity. And he's baptized on Christmas Day in 496. And this particular detail is actually vitally important because Clovis has converted to the Christian faith, but he has not converted to the Arian faith, which is what the vast majority of all of the other Christianized tribes in Northern Europe believed. And so, as a result of converting to the Nicene faith, he now also has some relationship with the established leaders of the Western Church, and in particular the Pope. Now, in many ways, Clovis doesn't change a whole lot. He remains the same, largely the same as he did before he converted. He still goes around skirmishing with his neighbors, with his war bands, and seeking to expand his kingdom. And the idea for the Merovingians was to go around and attack people and tribes and then take land. And then once the land had been taken, Clovis, or any other king that came after him, would distribute the land and parcel it out among his comes, the leaders of his war bands, to defend the land and then run things in the name of the king, just so that the king doesn't have to directly oversee everything all at one time. And you can imagine how constantly taking and then doling out land might make things kind of feel like there's not enough room in the empire, the kingdom. And so that drove continued fighting and then continued expansion of the Merovingians to to the point where they grew to what you see now, taking over most of Western and then even into Central Europe. While they did grow enormously and they eventually did hold sway over the majority of Western Europe, this actually ended up weakening them, even though they didn't realize it at the time, because too many people had power in the Frankish kingdom. And it was this weakening, along with the fact that the Merovingians didn't have in place the system of primogeniture, which I don't know if you've ever heard of that before, but primogeniture is the policy of the king giving the kingdom and everything else to the oldest son. Now, we may think today that that seems unfair, or it's just an odd or weird or wrong practice, because it, cuts out. If you have a bunch of kids and you give everything to your oldest son, it cuts out all other subsequent sons or any daughters. But the reason why this practice came to be adopted almost universally during the Middle Ages by almost all the kingdoms of Europe is because of what took place among the Merovingians. As each king died, if he had a number of sons, the kingdom would be distributed amongst them equally. And we see this start with Clovis. Clovis had 4 sons: Clothar, Clodomir, Childebert, and Theodoric. And when Clovis dies, those 4 sons broke up the empire into 4 equal parts. As you can see here, if you look closely, Theodoric took the kingdom of Reims in the northwest. Clodomir took the kingdom of Orleans to the west. Childebert took the kingdom of Paris to the northeast, there in red. And Clothar took the kingdom of Soissons, there in green, to the north. Now, mercifully in this case, none of the 4 of them lived long enough to have a bunch more sons and break up the empire into even more pieces. In fact, the 3 oldest brothers actually died pretty quickly. So it was left to Clothar to take back all of these realms once his brothers had died. Unfortunately, Clothar made the same mistake that Clovis did, his father did. He had 4 sons, and those 4 sons divided up the kingdom even further into smaller kingdoms. So the problem with what's here called progeniture, which is the idea of equal division of land and assets amongst all of your children, in this case all of your sons, is that while it may have seemed fair to divvy everything up equally among your kids, by doing so, the Merovingians ended up having too many cooks in the kitchen, and they weakened themselves further as a result. And while it became customary for the Frankish kings actually to divide their lands between their children for several generations to come, eventually it fatally weakened the Merovingians to a point of no return. They had too much division. There was too much subtraction of land into the hands of all the king's sons. And as they began to weaken, we see the rise of the position among the different Merovingian kingdoms that's called the mayor of the palace. And it's from this position that the Carolingian dynasty is born, what will go from the Frankish kingdom to the Frankish Empire. I honestly, I appreciate you sticking with me for all of that, because what looking at the Merovingians does, while it may not seem tremendously pertinent, is it establishes the context from which the Carolingians, including Charlemagne, came from and how they rose to power. The Merovingians didn't do as much for the spread and development of the faith as the Carolingians would go on to do. But that's not to say they didn't do anything for it at all, particularly because of Clovis converting to the Nicene Orthodox Christian faith, because that established Nicene Christianity and not Arian Christianity as the predominant religion for all of the kings to come among the Merovingians. And we'll see how much that will affect the development of the church in the West, as it will begin to later flourish under the centralized and unified rule of the Carolingians. Believe it or not, the Carolingians are not an altogether different dynasty that comes on the scene and replaces the Merovingians. They are born from, as I said, this position of the mayor of the palace. The mayor of the palace functioned basically like a prime minister would today. They were the right-hand man of the king, the real head of state, and they would govern in his place if the king was away in battle or away on a trip, or honestly just didn't feel like governing that day. The early Carolingian rulers were these mayors of the palace, because as the Merovingians weakened further and further and further, between splitting their lands and fighting with each other over those lands, they entrusted more and more governing power into the hands of these mayors of the palace. And as these mayors of the palace began to engage in the politics of the day and go on to war on behalf of the Merovingians, they eventually began to take on power unto themselves. And one of the first really serious Carolingian rulers that we see was a guy named Pepin. You can see here, this is the picture of Pepin. Pepin of Herstal. It's alternately rendered as Pippin, which if you've ever read or seen Lord of the Rings, that's almost certainly where that name came from, because Tolkien was an expert on the Middle Ages. So in 687, Pepin defeats one of the old archenemies of the Merovingians, called the Thuringians. They were a group out east that had been a thorn in the side of the Merovingians for a long time, but Pepin manages to defeat them. But he doesn't just defeat them. He defeats them in such a way that it becomes seen even more clearly to the rest of Europe that Pepin is more in command than the Merovingians themselves. Pepin was succeeded by his son, Charles Martel, also known, as you could probably guess by this picture, as Charles the Hammer, who would further pursue his own military glory and his own accumulation of power. He's ruthless in battle, and one of his main strategies leans on the use of cavalry at a time when most tribes in the north still mostly fought on foot. And, as you can imagine, riding a huge, powerful animal into battle gives you not just a physical advantage over a soldier on foot, but also a psychological advantage, because if you're a guy on foot, here comes these waves of big horses carrying armored warriors just mowing down men on foot left and right. Obviously, that's going to demoralize you. So Charles fights viciously, and he fights hard, but he's not just a fighter. Because it's Charles who also begins to court a relationship with the papacy at this time. And what Charles does is he gifts the papacy all of the central part of the boot of Italy, the Italian peninsula, outright. Excuse me. And so this donation of central Italy to the papacy forms, for really the first time, what we would come to know for centuries as the Papal States, which served for them as a seat of geographic power for them to expand further across the West. Charles Martel was followed by his son Pepin III, also called Pepin the Short. And because of the good relationship between this family and the papacy, eventually the papacy sides against the Merovingians, and with this new dynasty that's being formed around Pepin and Charles and Pepin again. So much so that in 751, the Pope at the time, Pope Zacharias, actually decrees that the last Merovingian emperor, who was Childeric III, is to be deposed. And his reasoning is obscenely simple. Anyone who rules like a king should be the king. And the Merovingians had long since stopped truly ruling over their empire. That had long since fallen to the mayors of the palace, the guys like Pepin and Charles Martel, and now Pepin again. And the single most important event that would solidify the dominance of this new upcoming dynasty was the Battle of Tours in 732. It was here that the Frankish armies under Charles Martel met the armies of the Islamic Umayyad Caliphate, the rulers of Spain, which at that time was already being called Al-Andalus. Deep in Frankish territory near the city of Tours, which is only about 150 miles from the city of Paris. At this time, the Muslim rulers of Spain have already spent the better part of 2 decades conquering the Iberian Peninsula, so Spain and Portugal. And then in the 720s, this army crosses over the Pyrenees Mountains, which separate Spain and France, and into the region of Aquitaine. Aquitaine at this time was not part of any Frankish kingdom. It had its own king, Odo, who often was at odds with the Merovingians and would skirmish with them on his borders, particularly with Charles over their attempts to annex Aquitaine into the Frankish Empire. But Odo very quickly realized that he was facing a much greater threat as this Umayyad army begins to move north across Aquitaine. And while he did his best to repel them and then even won a battle against them, it soon became far too much for him to handle alone. And so of all the people that he could have appealed to, he appeals to Charles Martel for help. And Charles also realizes that an advancing Muslim army is a much bigger danger than a lone enemy like one king in one territory. And so an agreement is reached. Aquitaine becomes part of the Frankish Empire. Odo joins forces with Charles, and this joint army would fight back against the Umayyad army. And in October of 732, we have the Battle of Tours. To understand this battle, we need to know briefly just a bit about how warfare worked in the Middle Ages. At this time, you didn't really have these sort of immense, large-scale battles with tens of thousands all fighting at the same time. That was rare, if not non-existent. What you had were smaller skirmishes at certain points between handfuls of each army. They would try to cut each other's supply lines, try to break the discipline and morale of the other army. You did not see what Hollywood portrays, like something like Braveheart, for example, where all of both armies rush at each other in a giant battle where a lot of men die really quickly. That doesn't happen. The leaders of this time were not stupid. The goal was to avoid getting a lot of men killed as quickly as possible. Another distinctive about warfare at this time was that armies were almost never very well trained. Battles usually had to happen during certain seasons. No one was fighting in the dead of winter. And a lot of times you would have to send home at least some men, if not potentially all men, to cultivate and harvest crops. Because if there's no one around to do that, whether you want to keep fighting or not, you're eventually going to starve. But the army under Charles Martel was different. Because of his close ties to the church and the papacy, Charles was able to use funds given to him by the papacy to maintain a well-trained standing army year-round. And he's also a brilliant tactician, and he knows that the Muslim army made great use of cavalry. They had fast, hard-striking units that would charge the enemy line and try to break them up as fast and as hard as they could. So what Charles does to counter this is he develops a phalanx, which if you've heard of the phalanx before, it's not like the ones that the ancient Greeks had, which were a triangle. It was a rectangular phalanx, which was made up of tough, disciplined men who would hold their ground and hold the line and stop cavalry dead in their tracks. Charles also uses the element of surprise. He scopes out the area, he stations his forces on the high ground, and he also conceals the bulk of his forces to make the Umayyads think that their numerical advantage is a lot greater than it actually is. But despite all of this brilliance and this planning, Charles is still outmanned. We don't have and have never had reliable numbers from either Muslim or Frankish sources on how many troops either army had. The Muslims have said that the Franks had 400,000 men, which was entirely impossible at this time. And the Franks said that the Muslims had innumerable men. But the best modern guesstimates put the Umayyad force of the Muslims between 60 and 80,000 men, maybe as many as 90,000 men. And the Frankish force was somewhere around 30,000. So Charles is outnumbered at least 2 to 1, maybe even 3 to 1. But as they advanced into France, the Muslim army had unintentionally but significantly weakened itself because it had marched well out of range of their supply lines. They also were not prepared for the cold of northern Europe. They didn't have the right gear for it. So that their numerical advantage was actually a disadvantage because they weren't prepared for the season and they had fewer supplies to work with. And so, as I said, just before the battle, Charles takes the high ground there outside of the city of Tours, and he hides most of his army in the woods and out of sight. Out in front is the phalanx forming the line. And for a while, it was almost sort of like Red Rover between the two armies. The Umayyads knew that it was a bad idea to charge uphill at the enemy. It was pretty much suicidal. So they kept trying to bait and draw out the Franks, but they didn't take the bait. And so eventually the Muslims charge uphill in the Frankish line. They're convinced that their numbers and tactics are so superior that they can survive an uphill cavalry charge. And there are two different versions of what happens next. Either the charge was decisively repelled and the Muslims retreated, or, according to at least one, if not multiple, Umayyad sources, a rumor had been spread that the supply camps were being plundered by a separate regiment of Frankish troops. And they were making off with both supplies, but then also the vast spoils of war that this army had acquired over a couple of decades now while they were on campaign. I think honestly, it's entirely possible that both things are true. The accounts don't really contradict with these two explanations, so I think they easily could have both happened. But in either case, the cavalry charge did not break the line for the Franks, and at some point, the Muslim army fled. Charles waits up on the hill for a time. He doesn't think that the battle is over, but eventually he sends out scouting parties who discovered that in the middle of the night, the Umayyads had fled back into Spain. Now, all of that being said, this is not just any battle, even though on its own terms it was significant because of how many troops were involved. The battle is significant because it came to be seen by virtually all Europeans for centuries, and even among many across the world to the present day, that the Christian armies of the West had fought against the Muslim armies to beat them back and stop them from conquering all of Europe. This is the battle that many, many historians, both then and now, view as the triumph of Europe over the advance of a unified Islam. The victory for Charles Martel, Charles the Hammer, was such a disgrace for the Muslim forces that no further attempts at conquest were made by any army from Al-Andalus past the Pyrenees Mountains ever again. And in the long, tortured, really, history of Christians fighting Muslims, this is one of the first really decisive battles between the two sides. Also, you'll notice that this predates the Crusades by over 400 years. So we can put to bed the notion that Christians and Muslims didn't really start fighting each other until the Crusades. But this battle also became hailed by all of Europe as an example of the power and the might of the now Frankish Empire. That Charles Martel had now displayed the prowess of the Franks against both other Europeans, but now also against a force that had threatened the Christian faith entirely and had threatened to ravage the church in Europe. Today, historians debate back and forth, at least some do, whether the battle was really as world-altering as it was made out to be. Some in the negative say that it was just a mere raid that the Westerners attached too much importance to. And then some in the positive go too far and say that if the Franks had lost, Europe and maybe even the entire world here in the present would be Muslim. I'm definitely not going to go that far because I don't think the plan of the Father was to allow his church to fail, quite simply. But it was certainly immensely important. That we can agree on. And in the end, the rise of the Frankish or the Carolingian Empire out of the Merovingians sets the stage for really one of the greatest rulers in all of European history, maybe even world history. Charles Martel's grandson was also named Charles. And this Charles would take up the vision of his father, his grandfather, and his great-grandfather before him, and he would see it come to fruition, and he would achieve their vision and much, much more. And for that, he would be called Charles the Great, or as we know him today, Charlemagne. And so after the break, and we'll go to break now, we'll continue with the story of the Frankish Empire, and we'll look at the rise of Charlemagne and the great cultural renaissance that he achieved during his reign. As we come back and we start to take a look at the life of Charlemagne, I want to briefly pause and use our imaginations for a second. It's the year 800, and we're standing in the Basilica of St. Peter's in Rome. And if you've ever seen pictures of St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican today, or even if you haven't, here it is here, you may not know that the modern building that you see was not really built until the time of the Reformation. We are in Old St. Peter's Basilica, which was built on top of an old Christian graveyard that dates back to the time of ancient Rome. It was actually next to where the Circus Maximus used to be, there in Rome. It was originally built by Constantine to honor the martyrs and then to celebrate the victory of Christendom over the pagan world. But at this point in 800, at least for some people in the church, it seemed that maybe the pagans of the world were gaining the upper hand again. The Lombards in and around the Italian peninsula were wreaking havoc, causing trouble across the peninsula, causing trouble for the papacy. Rome itself, the citizens of Rome themselves, were often quite hostile to the papacy. So by the 8th century, or the end of the 8th century, as the Frankish Empire has come out of the Merovingian dynasty, and as they've expanded their rule over northern Europe, the partnership between the papacy and the Franks begins to deepen. On Christmas Day, in 800, during the Mass, Charlemagne was kneeling down to pray, so it goes. The story that we're told is that the Pope reached for a crown, placed it on Charlemagne's head, and declared that he was now the new Emperor of Rome. And many at the time, and even all the way to the present day, were shocked by this. Modern sensibilities saw it as sort of a spiritual takeover of politics. They saw it as sort of the first time that the church had managed to infiltrate the state or merge with the state, or however they would choose to phrase it. But we know at this point that that's not accurate, because Constantine did that almost 500 years before. We didn't need Charlemagne or Pope Leo III to accomplish that. Though at the time, or those at the time, were equally offended to people today, because as you may remember from our discussion last week on the Byzantines in the East, the Eastern Roman Empire, saw their empire as the Roman Empire. They believed that all of the territory that was now being claimed by the Franks was theirs. It was actually theirs. It was still under their domain. It was still under their control. And so sorry, I had a technical difficulty. Here we go. Sorry about that. As I said, the Byzantines in the East had claimed that the lands that the Franks controlled were theirs rightfully. They already had an emperor, actually an empress at the time, but now the papacy has declared that there's a new emperor. And not just that, but this emperor is one over the West alone. For centuries, the fact that the papacy decided to coronate its own emperor in the West became one of the really serious bones of contention between the church in the West and the church in the East. For those in the West, though, it was a sign of God's providence and God's love, that the West would return to glory, that the West would now finally, for the first time since the time of Rome, be unified. And for them, and for the rest of Western history down to the modern day, the Pope's decision to coronate Charlemagne as Holy Roman Emperor on Christmas Day there in 800 marked the beginning of what is known to history as the Holy Roman Empire. So, who was Charlemagne, though? What was his reign like? How did he conquer so much land in so short a time? And what was his effect on European culture? As we see, or will see, Charlemagne brought about one of the most important cultural movements in all of Western history, which we know today as the Carolingian Renaissance. And lastly, we'll look at how Charlemagne shaped and changed the church as it developed from an early ancient church into a medieval Western European church. We don't know for sure when Charlemagne was born, and we only know so much about who he was as a person. We know that he was slender in build, but exceptionally tall for the time, somewhere between 6 foot and 6'5", at a time when the average man was between 5'4" and 5'6". We're told that some of his favorite activities included reading, most often Christian works, particularly Augustine's City of God. He enjoyed music, and apparently he especially enjoyed eating. One writer, his biographer actually, that sat on his court, once wrote that, quote, his meals ordinarily consisted of 4 courses, not counting the roast, which his huntsman used to bring in on the spit. We're also told that he was an insomniac. He most of the time only slept a couple of hours at night. He's said to have always been dressed in the garb of the Franks, as it was called, very modest clothing, but with all sorts of jewelry and finery on top of that modest clothing. And it's commonly held or believed that the length of his own foot would go on to serve as the basis for the modern unit of measurement by the same name, which is actually at least partially true. If what we're told is correct, he did have a 12-inch foot. So that would make sense that legend would come about. One of the most important things about Charlemagne's reign is how much land he conquered during his reign. Charles Martel, his grandfather, and Pepin the Short, his father, had already conquered an enormous amount of land already, even more than the Merovingians had before them. They already had under their authority the regions of Aquitaine, Burgundy, and as you can see, most of what we would now know today as France, Germany, and the Netherlands as well. But there were regions that these two were never able to bring under their dominion, and it's these regions that Charlemagne manages to conquer. So his conquests weren't so much about him taking over more territory than his predecessors. It was about him conquering lands that were challenging to his predecessors and finally bringing them into the Frankish Empire. And these regions included the area of Lombardy, which is essentially the north and central parts of Italy, there in the south of the map. Bavaria, which is now southeastern Germany. And most importantly for them, Saxony, which is the north of modern Germany. Saxony being one of the Frankish Empire's most annoying neighbors and having been so for a very long time. He also took territory at the edges on the borders and turned it into these sort of buffer areas against more significant foes, such as the border with Spain and then areas out east as well. And so under Charlemagne, the Frankish Empire came at its height to span east to west some 850 miles. In other words, the vast majority of arable, farmable land on the European continent was under the dominion of the Frankish Empire. And a lot of that had to do with Charlemagne himself. We already saw how Charles Martel, his grandfather, was a supreme warrior who trained up his armies and employed superior tactics. And Charlemagne is the inheritor of this military tradition. The reason Charlemagne and the Franks under him were so successful and they expanded so quickly is because they were relentless and they were disciplined. In fact, the only time Charlemagne really loses in his time as king is when he tries to march into Muslim Spain and take territory. And he's actually soundly defeated there, and he does have to retreat. But Charlemagne reigns over most of the important areas of Europe. But he wasn't just a fighter like his grandfather before him. He also managed to establish the really good rule and administration of his empire. At his palace at Aachen, which is in northern Germany, sort of on the border of Belgium and the Netherlands, he arranged all kinds of ambassadors and legal experts and scholars and scribes in the effort to ensure that all of his decisions and rulings were to go out into the empire, and the people were to get the verdict in clear and concise language from the central imperial government. Charlemagne imposed all kinds of regulations related to taxes, the accrual of wealth, the registration of wealth so they could keep track of who owned what. But this was predominantly a period in which reason and intellect were applied to the legal profession for the first time in a realm outside of Rome. Significant attention to detail was applied to laws and precedents, and all of these things were codified and written down. Now, alongside these military conquests and changes in legal and administrative practices that Charlemagne accomplished during his reign, there was also this time that what historians call the Carolingian Renaissance. And this is a period of time in which some of the most significant intellectual minds of Europe are brought together by Charlemagne so that intellectual activity and letters and arts and manuscripts and all these things might flourish. And in today's world, we're used to seeing the arts as something that's more cosmetic and more secondary importance, something that's not vital. When you send your kids off to college, you're more likely trying to get them to graduate high school, get into college, get a degree, and get out and get a job. But understand that at a time when intellectual engagement and thinking and the arts were not at all significant or prescribed in society, for Charlemagne to take such a noted interest in these things was as much to do with the preservation of knowledge and culture as it was with the advancement of it. And the fact that there was a Carolingian Renaissance, by the way, should really undermine for you the lie that we're told in the modern day that these times were befitting of the title the Dark Ages. Maybe comparative to the later Renaissance, or from the standpoint that we don't have as much information or documentation on the time as we wish we had compared to maybe the Renaissance. Maybe you could call it the Dark Ages for that reason, but not for the simple reason that learning didn't happen, intellectualism didn't exist. What we see in Charlemagne's reign is a concerted effort and an attempt to ensure that the old Roman culture, the Romanitas, the ways in which the old world had engaged in the life of the mind, was going to continue. There's all kinds of ways in which Charlemagne sparked this Renaissance. Take architecture, for example. From 768, when he first became king of the Franks, not yet Holy Roman Emperor, but first king of the Franks, on until the end of the reign of his grandson, Lothar, in 855, the Franks embarked on a massive building program. At least 30 major cathedrals and over 400 monasteries were built across the realms of the Frankish Empire. And that doesn't even count any royal palaces or any of the palaces of the broader nobility, nothing like that. Charlemagne also drew around him the leading intellectuals of Europe. Prior to his coronation, and even into the time of his reign, perhaps the single most important intellectual sphere in all of European society was in the British Isles. The British Isles, so England, Scotland, Ireland in particular, had a significant intellectual tradition, particularly among their monasteries and their monks. They were very literate. They wrote a great deal, at least much more compared to a lot of the monasteries and monks on the continent, that is. But what Charlemagne does is he does his utmost to attract many of these great scholars from the British Isles and from other parts of the empire and broader Europe, and even from outside, perhaps, of some of Europe, to his palace there at Aachen. And by far, one of the most important things that is cultivated by this collaboration of great minds is a new form of handwriting that has never been seen before. A lot of times when you study the past, you come across these various styles of writing in various languages, and they're almost impossible to understand or translate. Take, for example, here, Old Roman cursive. I don't know about you, but I can't understand what that says. You can see how difficult it would be to try to understand that. It would take years of training and understanding how the system of Old Roman cursive works to know what that is. Otherwise, it's just squiggles. It might as well be alien language. But these scholars at Charlemagne's court come to develop and introduce what's called Carolingian minuscule. And it was a uniform system of sentence structure and punctuation and capitalization and other things. So we'll take a look at that. And as you can see, maybe you still can't understand it, but compared to what we just saw, this would be a breeze to try to read on just on the level of clarity and the ease of reading itself. And we take this for granted, really. We're used to simple printing when we write. We're used to uniform fonts. We're used to a straightforward system of punctuation, at least those of us that use proper punctuation. These things didn't really exist in the world, not even under the Greeks or the Romans. By and large, most Greek and Roman writing was all of the words smushed together in all caps with no punctuation. For reference, that's part of why Bible translation from the Greek is so difficult, because you have to figure out from context and context alone how the sentence should be structured and where punctuation should go and what should be capitalized and what shouldn't. So because of the clarity that Carolingian minuscule here, Carolingian script, another way to call it, has, the clarity that it has, and because of its simplicity, learning and education and transcription in the West are greatly enhanced. And even into the later Middle Ages, and even into the Renaissance in particular, when scholars and humanists at the time would come across these original manuscripts written in the Carolingian script, they actually mistook it to be the way the ancient Romans used to write. And so, since they were all about wanting to stick to the original sources, they just wrote everything down then how it was written down under Charlemagne. And it was that script that was first written then and continued by Renaissance scholars, that system of writing that they used, that was what the first Bible that Gutenberg ever printed from the printing press utilized. And it's much of the basis for the fonts that we write in today. And if you don't think that this innovation is important, think for a moment about how you write things today. Do you capitalize every letter? Or do you only use that for maybe bolded titles or at the beginnings of sentences? Do you use periods and commas and semicolons and such, or do you let everything read as one long run-on sentence? Do you space your words? Or is every letter of every word written right next to each other with no room in between? Always remember, and this applies to lessons we've already learned, lessons we'll talk about soon, and lessons far in the future. Always remember that so much of what seems inconsequential in the past can have, and really has had, dramatic effects on the present. Another hallmark under Charlemagne was the reform of education. Education, for really the first time, at least in the west of Europe, if not all of Europe, morphed from something that was only accessible to the wealthy into something that was accessible to anyone who wanted to attempt to learn, which actually included Charlemagne himself. He wasn't tremendously educated, but, as one example, he spent years and years and years, almost till his death, trying to learn how to write. He never quite got it. He eventually gave it up in old age, saying he was too old to learn the skills. But despite not knowing how to write, or not being particularly well educated per se, he was a great lover of learning. He funded monasteries, as I said, across the empire. And he personally ensured that a copy of the Latin Vulgate, if you remember me talking about Jerome translating the Greek into the Latin and making the Vulgate, which Latin at this time was also still being spoken in a majority of the regions under the Franks. A copy of the Latin Vulgate was paid for by Charlemagne and provided to every single church in his empire. And as we've kind of hinted at, the epicenter of all these advances was the royal palace in the city of Aachen. And so here's a diagram of what we think it used to look like. There is technically still a palace at Aachen there in the city, but the vast majority of the old palace, the original palace under Charlemagne, is long gone. And what is left that you could say is still standing has been so renovated or redone that it's almost not even the original anymore. On one end, so the north end, I guess, to point it that way, you have what's called the Palatine Chapel. And that is actually the only part of the original palace that technically still stands today, although, as I said, it's been heavily renovated and restored. And there were actually 3 different chapels within this one building. There was the Chapel of Our Savior, the Chapel of the Virgin Mary, and the Chapel of St. Peter. And if you look for pictures of the designs in it, which we can see here, there we go. If you look close, it actually resembles much of the vision of the heavenly Jerusalem that's described in the Revelation. Here we can see the mosaic on the ceiling of the chapel. There at the bottom in red is Christ on the throne, and he's surrounded by the 24 elders. And on the second floor of the chapel was a marble throne for Charlemagne to be seated above all, for all to see. And the image here is that Charlemagne is occupying almost a divine seat of power. Not that he himself is divine, but rather he's divinely appointed as emperor. And we can sort of see this as the early stage of development for what would really solidify further into the Middle Ages the concept of what would eventually become the divine right of kings. This idea that the king was divinely appointed by and really only answerable to the Lord himself. This idea already existed, but it would be cemented really in place almost universally across Europe later in time. Other buildings that made up the palace complex included a menagerie, where Charlemagne actually kept an elephant that had been given to him by a ruler from the east, a gymnasium, a barracks, even a bathhouse built on top of actual thermal hot springs, which were actually the reason that Roman soldiers first built the city of Aachen in the first place. But the most important building was on this south end here that I've circled in yellow, and that was the council hall. And this is where Charlemagne would hold court and render legal decisions and verdicts and engage in various state functions and entertain ambassadors and such. But there was also, if you can see, this tower. And the tower was extremely important, indescribably important, because both the imperial treasury and the imperial archive were in this tower. They were kept in this tower. From the treasury, Charlemagne reformed the currency. He switched it from silver rather than gold so that there'd be an easier exchange of currency across Europe and so on. But the real key element was the archive. Because a copy of every legal decision, every manuscript, every written work created at the palace, and then eventually across most of the empire, was stored in the archive. And this is of, again, indescribable importance, because the culture of the preservation of knowledge that was being fostered under Charlemagne led to the preservation of so many works in the archive that we have somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 copies of documents spanning from the late Middle Ages all the way back to the ancient Greeks. And if it weren't for the archive, so much of what we know today, so many works today, both from the ancient and then also the medieval world, would have been lost to history and never recovered, maybe never known about. Many, many texts that we don't have the originals for, texts written in ancient Greek and ancient Latin in particular, would have been lost. But Charlemagne paid for these various manuscripts to be recovered from all over Europe and retrieved from wherever they were, brought back to Aachen, and copied. And it was because of this that throughout the Middle Ages, really, whenever you needed to view a manuscript from ancient times, there was almost certainly a copy in the archive at Aachen. And the last thing that we want to say when we look at Charlemagne and the Carolingian Renaissance is the way in which he reformed the church. Charlemagne was, as I've said, like his father and grandfather, intimately tied to the papacy. And he continues the policies of enforcing and regulating the Catholic faith in his realm. And this really shouldn't be underestimated, because as we've noted already, if there was any faith that was still top dog in Northern Europe, it's Arianism, still. There is Catholicism making headway from missionaries in other parts of Europe. But with the coming of Charlemagne, what you see is sort of the Catholicizing of Northern Europe, where Charlemagne attempts to establish once and for all the Nicene faith for all of Europe. So he does a number of things to ensure the regulation of churches in his realm. It's actually Charlemagne who was the first to require a mandatory tithe of specifically 10% of all goods to be enforced in all the churches. So if you thought that the 10% tithe amount came from either of the testaments, no. The Old Testament had the temple tax, which was not 10%, and the New Testament does not specify a tithe amount. It came from Charlemagne. He also takes an interest in the liturgy of the church, and he requires all churches to follow the pattern of liturgy that's been established there in Rome. He goes to great lengths to ensure that the clergy is well educated, or at least sufficiently educated. And at one point, he actually becomes pretty disappointed with what he believes is the poor quality of sermons in churches across his realms. And so he arranges for a number of high-ranking clergymen, particularly from Rome, to come to Aachen and write and draft a number of sermons that would actually be distributed to the churches. And if a priest or a pastor there was not educated enough or not great enough at exegesis or sermon preparation, he could just read this sermon. So Charlemagne is the first real major step towards developing a cohesive Catholic identity in Western Europe. And so the dominance of the papal Catholic religion in Western and Northern Europe might have been at least delayed or even reduced in its scope. But with a strong figure on the throne stressing obedience to the Catholic faith and stressing obedience to the papacy, we see Europe increasingly develop in the Middle Ages towards a unified Catholic Church. So in the end, Charlemagne is one of the most important figures in European history, as I said, maybe world history. His importance at the time becomes crystallized, really, within about 2 generations of his death, which is in 814. By this point, 3 of his grandsons, Lothar, Louis the German, and Charles the Bald, are fighting a civil war amongst themselves. And eventually, at the Treaty of Verdun in 843, they split the empire into 3 parts. Lothar would be given Lombardy, which was that region of Italy there in the south. Louis would be given what would become East Francia, which would be Germany, and Charles the Bald was given the western part of the empire, which was West Francia. These would first become France, the Holy Roman Empire, and then the Italian states, and they would eventually go on to become modern France, Germany, and Italy today. The kings of West Francia would claim to descend from Charlemagne, and they would be crowned at their coronation with what they called the crown of Charlemagne. It wasn't really, they just called it that. All the way into the 18th century, almost up until the time of the French Revolution. The kings of East Francia would inherit the title of a Holy Roman Emperor. That was one of the conditions of the treaty. And for over a millennium, from 800 all the way until 1806, the German peoples lived under the Holy Roman Empire until it was dissolved in 1806. So for reference, when Luther does what he does, he is a subject of the Holy Roman Empire. He's under the Holy Roman Emperor. The region that was once Lombardy, there in north and central Italy, was given to Lothar, as I said, which was the youngest of Charlemagne's grandsons. He quickly dies, and there becomes these various kingdoms and states across the peninsula. And Italy would remain from that time a divided multi-kingdom region until the unification of these kingdoms into the modern state of Italy in 1861. So well over 1,000 years. Charlemagne, though, as great as he was by no means perfect. He is well known to have had a terrible temper. And it was under him that the Frankish policy of forced Christianization, which unfortunately is highlighted by the brutal massacre at Verdun in southern Germany of 4,500 Saxons, pagan Saxons, who refused to convert. That policy was carried out against all the pagan tribes of the north. And that particular point will end up becoming very important after his death, because that policy, that Christianization on penalty of death, will become one of the main reasons, not the main reason, maybe not even top 3 reasons, but one of the main reasons behind the beginning of the Viking raids across the continent and the era of Viking expansion, which we'll get into in a couple of weeks. But suffice to say, rising from its roots in the Merovingian dynasty and the ashes of the Merovingians' fall came the Frankish Empire, the Carolingian dynasty, the great flourishing of learning and education in the Carolingian Renaissance, and the immeasurably influential reign of Charlemagne. And we continue to see that to this day, both in Europe and even here in the States. I very, very much appreciate you sticking with me tonight. I realize we covered a lot of names, a lot of information, but I do hope that you can appreciate that we're trying to cover as much pertinent material as possible in a really very short period of time, comparatively. Next week, we'll take a look, as I said, at the British Isles, the influence of the monastic movement there and the intellectual tradition they brought about, the rise of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and England's own well-titled monarch, King Alfred the Great. We'll see the event on a small island off the English coast that eventually marked the start of the tidal wave of terror that we know as the Viking Age. And then we'll eventually see the conquering of England by the Normans, actually coming from the Frankish Empire in 1066. Ideally, I'll have a bit less to say then and take up a bit less of your time, but we'll see how it goes. So until next week, have a good night.